So I'm going to walk through in this video the different topics that we cover. And the first thing I start with is basically a base level overview of object-oriented programming in JavaScript using the class syntax. Constructors, inheritance, super, instance properties, static methods, that sort of stuff, which for a lot of you will likely be recap, but it's there to give us all a level playing field to make sure everyone's familiar with the basics, because then we move on to newer features in JavaScript that relate to OOP, object-oriented programming. Things like getters and setters, public fields, private methods, static initialization blocks. These are all features that are newer to JavaScript that have to do with classes. Then I have another section that is kind of, I wouldn't say beginner, but an intermediate section, probably not advanced, talking about the keyword this. How does the keyword this work? When do we get into trouble with the keyword this? How is it determined? We talk about things like global objects in Node versus in the browser, different rules for how we think about this, how this works in classes. And then we talk about three important methods, the call method, apply, and the bind method. We talk about how to use bind specifically to bind arguments, to fix problems with this. We talk about arrow functions in this, and then there's a little recap, gotchas that you can run into when working with the keyword this. After that, we then revisit object-oriented programming to talk about how it works under the hood. Things like constructor functions outside of classes, kind of the old school way of writing classes in JavaScript when we didn't actually have support for the class keyword. We talk about the new keyword, prototypes, a prototype chain, what double underscore proto is compared to the prototype property on functions, and we talk about important prototype methods like get prototype of, set prototype of, is prototype of, things like that. All about object-oriented programming and prototypes. Then we move on to talk about a very large topic, asynchronous JavaScript. Another section where some of this is hopefully familiar to a lot of you. The idea of callbacks, promises, working with .then and .catch, working with async functions. Even if that is all recap for you though, we then spend a lot of time talking about design patterns with async and await, with asynchronous operations, sending parallel operations off versus sequential operations, working with methods like promise.all versus promise.allSettled versus promise.race, and we talk about building our own promise objects from scratch and promisifying callback-based functionality, incorporating our own promises to make kind of a mini library that is promise-based that we can then await or use .then on. After that, we move on to some of the latest features in JavaScript. Just a little one-off section on some of the newer ES 2021. Most of them are ES 2021 features. Some of them are ES 2022. And that's the only thing that joins these topics together. Optional chaining, the nullish coalescing operator, some new methods that have been introduced, string.replaceAll, array.prototype.at. We talk about some new assignment operators, things like logical OR assignment, nullish coalescing assignment. We talk about promise.any, and we talk about the new numeric separator syntax. So some of these features may be new to you, even if you learned JavaScript just a few years ago. Then we move on to a section I'm calling JavaScript, the tricky parts. Nothing really ties these individual topics together other than the fact that they trip people up. They can come up in interviews. They're just kind of weird parts of JavaScript. So we'll cover things like float imprecision, handling not a number, and the confusing craziness of the fact that we have isNaN versus number.isNaN. We cover big int, which is a new data type in JavaScript, and how it handles really large numbers. Post-increment versus pre-increment operators, automatic semicolon insertion, generator functions, my favorite method in JavaScript, array.from, which is very powerful and versatile, but not that many people know all the different uses that it gives us. After that, we talk about what is really the tricky part of JavaScript, closures and scope. So this is a separate section just about scope and closures. We talk about the basic rules of scope, the scope chain in JavaScript, how immediately invoked function expressions work, what hoisting is, the rules of hoisting, the temporal dead zone with let and const, the scope chain, and then we spend a lot of time on closures. Examples of closures, when we can use closures, factory functions, closures within loops, closure gotchas. So just a lot of topics that have to do with scope and closures. Next, we move on to cover timers and animations. Now, most of you are probably familiar with things like set timeout, set interval, clear timeout, clear interval, and I do spend some time in this section covering the basics in case you're not. But most of this section is actually about more advanced use cases for these timer functions. We're going to write our own very fancy higher order debounce function, and we'll do the same thing for building a fancy throttle function. Very useful functionality and slightly more advanced than just the basics of set interval and set timeout. We'll talk about request animation frame and how to build performant animations with request animation frame. And this is honestly one of my favorite sections in the course. For such a simple topic, there are some pretty advanced concepts we get to cover. Then we move on to functional programming. Now, this is a pretty big section. If you're not familiar with functional programming, it's an approach to programming, you could say. It's independent of JavaScript. I show how to implement functional programming principles in JavaScript. We talk about the basics, things like recursion, pure functions, immutability, and then we dive into some functional programming concepts like partial application and composition. We write our own compose function. We talk about currying. We talk about sort of different levels of currying. And then I show a very simple example of a non-functional approach that we refactor into a functional approach as we build a simple dice game. And I increase the level of insanity of functional programming as we go. So that's a fun section. And then from there, we talk about some browser APIs. There's a lot of browser APIs we cover. We talk about fetch, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, making API calls from the browser. We talk about the basics, but also some more advanced concepts around headers, uploading files, working with multi-part form data. Then we move on to talking about web storage APIs. Things like local storage, but also session storage, different storage events we can use to sync up browser sessions, and the notorious IndexedDB, which I won't say anything else about, but it's a very interesting tool. From there, we still cover more browser APIs. We have a section that I kind of just threw together some APIs that weren't big enough for their own section. I talk about the geolocation API, how you can get live updating geolocation coordinates from a user, get user media to request their webcam or a user's audio from a microphone, and then probably one of my favorite topics in the whole course, intersection observers, a really cool API that we can do really interesting things with. We do some demos where we track how long an ad is on someone's screen versus when they scroll away versus when it's visible. We talk about lazy loading images, which is a technique Airbnb kind of pioneered years ago, and we use intersection observers to help us with that. From there, we move on to the Performance API and the Web Audio API. So the Performance API is all about measuring your application and your code's performance, and it's a very high precision tool. And then we talk about Web Audio, which allows you to synthesize audio directly within the browser, working with sound waves. From there, we talk about Canvas, a really fun topic. I went kind of overboard with Canvas. I was planning on doing just a few videos, but I talk about how we can draw strokes, lines, circles, paths, arcs, how to manage different layers in Canvas, and then we build a little physics, I shouldn't say simulation, it's a very simple demo of bouncing balls that we use request animation frame plus Canvas to build a pretty fun demo. And then we move on to WebSockets. We'll learn all about WebSockets, what they are, how they work, the protocol, the browser API. I build a little Express backend for a chat app, and then we implement the front end for a live chat application. And then we talk about the Notifications API, how you can natively send notifications directly from within Chrome. And then we circle back to our WebSockets chat app and actually implement notifications so that someone gets notified, even if they're not looking at their browser window, when somebody chats them. Then we switch gears and we go back to object-oriented principles. So this is all about design patterns at the end of the course. I put this at the end, to be honest, because I thought some people might find it boring and I didn't want to put it right at the beginning and, I don't know, get some bad reviews because it's not the most engaging content to everyone, but it is very important stuff. We talk about the 5 solid programming principles. These are very famous 5 principles, SOLID, single responsibility, open close, list substitution, interface segregation, dependency inversion, and then I threw in a different object-oriented principle also at the end, the law of Demeter. So these are all about rules that some people follow when writing class-based or object-oriented code. And then we talk about design patterns, a really important section right at the end. I cover a handful of different patterns that have names, like the module pattern, singleton, observer, registry, and the mix-in pattern. And then we talk about the proxy pattern, specifically with an emphasis on the built-in JavaScript proxy objects, which allow you to kind of intersect basic object and function functionality and act as a proxy. So that's coming up at the end of the course. There's a whole bunch of stuff along the way, lots of quizzes, little exercises. There's a lot of content